Hello and welcome. This is Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I'm here with my special guest today, Joanna Penn. Hello, Joanna. How are you today?
Hi, Karen. It's so lovely to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. And before we start our conversation, I'll tell you a little bit more about Joanna. She is an award-nominated New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of thrillers under the name J.F. Penn. She also writes inspirational nonfiction for authors and is an award-winning creative entrepreneur and international professional speaker. Her site, thecreativepenn.com, is regularly voted one of the top 10 sites for writers and self-publishers. And I can tell you, I've been following Joanna for the past 3 years at least and have found everything she teaches and talks about so helpful to me for my nonfiction, for being a self-published nonfiction author, getting that out into the world and learning how to market and promote my own work. But also, Joanna has inspired me to try my hand at fiction, which has really opened up all new worlds for me. So, Joanna, I owe you great thanks for your inspiration and then also for your willingness to be here today.
Oh, thank you so much. And just, kind of before we start the show, I mean, sharing honestly about our journeys is what I've been doing on my show, and this is what you do on your show as well. So, I think we've connected on that level. So I'm looking forward to today.
Yes, well, this conversation is it's a little bit different for both of us in terms of what we normally talk about. I haven't talked very much in my podcast about myself as a writer and my journey as a writer. But that's what made me want to talk to you, because I seem to be meeting more and more people who tell me they want to write books. I'm sure you do as well. And even in the area, the end of life area where I work, I'm meeting more and more people who tell me they're carrying stories with them that they need to tell, they need to put on paper. And so I thought of you as, you've been my teacher, and you would be a great teacher for other people out there who are wondering how do they go about this? How do they tell their stories? So I wanted to start by just asking you your thoughts. I have a quote from Seth Godin who says, "The book that will most change your life is the book you write." And I'm curious to know if you have found that to be true.
Yeah, it's so funny because I've used that quote as well myself, and Seth has been a sort of mentor for me and many authors in the marketing space, particularly because he talks about authenticity, and, you and I definitely agree on authenticity. So, I mean, in terms of, I totally agree with that, because the first book I published, and I think this is really important, we'll be talking in this interview about writing versus a published book, which are two different things. But the first published book I put out is now out there as Career Change. But the first iteration of that book that I put out in 2008, literally sold 100 copies. And it was so disappointing in a sales way, but that book changed my life because I learned about the process of writing a nonfiction book, so the research, the structuring, the actual writing the words on a page, thinking about a reader, and then I learned about publishing and also book marketing. So that book changed my life, and because I wrote that book, I started thecreativepenn.com, Penn with a double M, in order to share the lessons I'd learned along the way. And that would probably be my first tip for people listening, is whatever you have experienced in your life will help other people. And even if that, the first thing you write doesn't necessarily hit home, the experience of writing that book will also, help you next time. So I think, it's sort of writing to work out what you think about something, because, this is the other thing. I think if people haven't written a book yet, I think it's something like 80% of Americans want to write a book, one of these surveys. And yet a very few percentage, very few people actually go forward and write that book, because it's interesting that writing a book and actually finishing a manuscript is a lot harder than writing in your journal. So I don't know if you found that as well, because you're obviously a writer.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I tried for a number of years while I was still in medical practice, I tried to start writing. I knew I wanted to write a book, and I tried to start writing so many different times, and I would write chapters or stories, and every time I'd finish one piece, I would go back and look at it and think, well, writing that actually changed me. I actually learned something just by writing it, and now I have to rewrite it because I see it differently than when I started it. And I found myself just endlessly rewriting, writing one thing and then rewriting it over and over and over again. I never really got anywhere.
Oh, well, that's actually really interesting, because this is one of the reasons I really like blogging. And I know you blog and write articles. And actually, there are kind of two thoughts on this. One is, yeah, you've moved on, so you could just delete that stuff, right? But I look back at some articles I wrote in 2008, 2009, even a couple of years ago now. And you're right, I've changed. But what's interesting is that journey. And I mean, you know, you write about grief, and there's the journey of grief that people go through, the kind of, you know, the predictable steps of some of these life things that happen. And I actually just did a page on my site, a timeline site, so thecreativepenn.com/timeline. And looking back on how I thought about things a few years ago versus now is actually very powerful. And I think that can help people too, because again, like going through grief or the death of a loved one, how you felt that raw emotion at the beginning versus what you might have felt a year later or 2 years later in reflection. And then, you know, for example, when people experience a divorce or the death of a spouse or a partner, and then a couple of years later, or, you know, however long, they meet someone else, they're meeting someone else as a different person as they were before. So I think that you know, and it's that quote, you never step in a river twice or something, you know, because the water flows past. So what you're saying is completely true. But I would say publish at that point, and then publish again a different thing later on, and you will be a different person.
That's so true, and it's really good advice. And I think about your material because as I've become a student of yours, you know, I've gone back and listened to all of your podcasts from the early days, and it's very clear to a listener of your progress and your journey, but it's actually very instructive, and that makes me realize that is how one way we learn from one another. We get to see each other at different parts of our journey. And it reminds me it's okay to be a beginner. It's okay to be at the beginning and not know everything. And it's really, I just love listening to your earlier podcasts, and I know where you are right now. And I know when you recorded that podcast, you had no idea where you were headed and that you were going to end up where you are right now. And so, but that it's such a good reminder that life is always changing. We're always growing, and we shouldn't feel bad that 5 years ago I didn't know the things I know now because that's how it is.
Exactly. And it's so funny that you've listened to those shows. So for people listening, I've been podcasting since March 2009. And I mean, you know, which is kind of crazy. Before I wrote fiction, you know, before I made any money at writing, you know, so many things before it happened. And of course, no one was listening back in March 2009. But it's so funny. You know, I don't listen to any of my old podcasts. So sometimes I think I should, because it would be interesting. But what's, I think, important is I never used to do a personal update. So I've listened to a couple of your recent shows, and you actually do a lot more personal stuff now. I haven't listened to all your backlist, but it's interesting because someone, a listener, emailed me and said, you should share your journey in the introduction to the interviews. Before you do an interview, you should share something personal. And at first, I really resisted that. I don't think I did that for about 3 years. The first 3 years of the podcast were just interviews, and I kept myself in the kind of in the background. And then as time goes on, you realize that people listen to your podcast because of you. So, you know, they're here because of Karen, not because of Joanna. And they might, some of you listening might transition over to my podcast. But when you put something out of yourself into the world, whether it's a blog post or a book or a podcast or a video, or even like an Instagram picture, it's a little piece of you going out into the world, and what you share will really help other people. So, you know, the deep topics that you talk about on your show, I was looking at the death of the pets, because that's something that my mum is far more devastated about the death of her beloved dogs than she was about like the death of her parents. and these deeper topics, if you don't share them and your own perspective, then how can you help other people? So yes, sharing personally is the thing that will help you, but also will help other people.
And that's interesting because also when I started doing interviews back in 2013 and interviewing experts who do various work in the end of life. And I never really talked about myself or my own writing or my own experience in those early days. Just as you were saying, I did the interviews because I was kind of embarrassed. I wasn't sure it was okay to talk about me, and I thought, well, I'll just keep promoting other people. But something similar happened. People said, I'm curious about you. Who are you? Because I realized like parts of who I am were showing through in the interviews that I was doing, and people were saying, I want to know more about you and what you do and what you think about. And really they were getting to know me because they would hear my voice on every single interview and hear the questions I asked and the comments I made. And that's what gave me, well, also listening to your podcast gave me the courage to start doing more episodes where I just talk and I just share. And I started realizing, gosh, from all my life experience and work experience, I have a lot of things I'd like to tell people. And so why not? Why not include that?
Yeah, definitely. It's so important, and I guess kind of talking about how does writing help us heal? Sort of going on for that. The book that will change your life is the book you write, but also that transformation. I feel like coming back to what I was saying about whether it's a journal or a published book. The line there is interesting because I have like 3 journals that I wrote in a sort of 4-month period when my first husband left me. And it was a grief situation because it was very unexpected and shocking, and I didn't know what to do. And in terms of mental health around grief, I wanted to self-harm. I felt these desperate things that people do. And when I look at those journals, so those words, that person that's in those journals, I have not shared that anywhere. That hasn't, I've not published any of those words from that time. When I read them, I don't even recognize that person. And I think that's really important for our conversation is there are things that we write for therapy, and then there are things that we write for publication. So if you know that what you're going to put out in the world is public, like our conversation, I know is going out to, we don't know who's going to listen to this conversation. So we both are being authentic, but we also might have a slight filter. But I haven't published those words about my grief from that time. So I think that's something to consider as well when people are thinking about their own difficult personal situations, is writing for therapy versus writing for publication. So is that something that you've seen in your practice?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I agree with you. Some things are really not for public consumption. Some things should be kept personal and private because they're the ruminations of our, the inner workings of how we're processing something. And the truth is, when we're in the midst of grief and writing about that, we may not have very much wisdom about that process in that moment. We have a lot of pain that we can put on paper, but we may not have the complete perspective of what's happening. And I think for me, some of the most powerful writing that I did about my father's suicide death actually came 20 years after he died, because I'd had so much time in order to process all of that and in order to put it in its place and get perspective and see a much bigger picture. And then I wasn't just writing about the pain and processing it. I was actually writing about all the wisdom that I gained from going through that pain. And so I think, at least I think that might be what you're saying, that to be valuable to other people, we want it to have a bigger perspective more than just ventilating our personal inner inner workings. We want to have wisdom attached to it that sometimes comes much later.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And that distance can be very hard when you're close to that situation, and you might be. I know we're going to come on to this sort of protecting yourself, but yeah, when you're close to it, you can almost harm yourself more if you put it out into the world. We've all seen things on the media where we've gone, you probably shouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. You probably should have just sat on that for a while, and so this sort of. But I think if you're the type of person who works things out by writing, and this is what I think a writer sometimes is, right? Someone who almost doesn't know what they think until they write it down. And that's how I am. I know some people write books because, maybe they have a particular idea, they want to spread that idea, or they have a business and they want to get people to that business. But if you're someone who almost can't work out what they think until they write it, that's definitely me. So Desecration, for example, which was sort of the first novel where I really let loose on some of this death stuff. I had gone to a medical specimen museum, the Hunterian in London, and, the body parts in jars type thing. And I was thinking about, wow, these were people, this foot, this random big foot was somebody once. And I started to think about the meaning of the physical body and, tattooing as well, and body modification, what that means when you're alive, and then what happens to your physical body when you're dead, and what does that mean from a more existential perspective. And I really didn't know what the hell I was thinking at the time. I just knew that I kind of was really fascinated by this idea, and what were the different ways that physical bodies were used after death, with transplants or art. And that's fascinating in itself. So I didn't know what I thought about those topics before I researched and then wrote that novel. So I think that's kind of another angle, is working out what you feel by writing. So maybe, is that what happened to you with your father's suicide?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The writing itself, it was so clarifying for me as I put words on paper. And at times I found myself, I was writing something that I realized I've never thought about this before, yet here I am writing it right now. And so I was able to go back and like reread those words and get so much clarity. And it felt to me as if pieces of a puzzle fell into place once I started putting it down on paper. As if things that I'd never connected before, I could suddenly see how they fit together. And that was very healing and transformative for me.
And I think the difference there between something that actually happened to you and a story, is I haven't. I mean, I have a lot of death in and murders in my book, but obviously I haven't murdered someone and chopped up their body to put in medical specimen jars.
Yes.
Kind of the difference between fiction and nonfiction.
Yes. At least I hope that you have not. I hope that you haven't.
Although it's funny, this week actually, I know lots of crime writers and thriller writers, and someone shared in a Facebook group, someone's actually been arrested in Spain for, murdering people in the way that he wrote in his best-selling crime novel. And we're all like, okay, everyone, just checking we're all normal in here.
Wow, that's very interesting.
It is, but it's okay, I'm fine. And what's nice about your show is I know that people won't think we're weird for talking about this, whereas I often feel on my podcast, if I mention cemeteries or death or graveyards, and people think I'm probably weird, but I feel among friends on your show.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Well, you mentioning fiction, though, that one other thought that I had is to talk about when it may be better to write a fictional story in order to talk about our process or our experience, to write it as fiction rather than writing it as a memoir. Because I met someone who had written a story about her father's death, and her other relatives are very angry at her and have now kind of ostracized her for writing about it in such a truthful way. And I wondered if there are times when it could be better if we fictionalize. We want to tell a story of loss and grief, but if we make it fictional so that we don't risk hurting other people by telling our true to life story. And I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think there's two different things, because writing a memoir or a non-fiction book is a very, very different skill set to writing a novel. So first of all, it's not necessarily just that, I think I'll write this as a novel rather than a non-fiction book. So, you actually have to learn different skills if you're going to write a novel. The next thing is, if you want to write your truth and a true story, a memoir or a narrative nonfiction or an autobiography, you can use a pseudonym. So this would be my recommendation. If you've written something that you feel might hurt people involved, you change names. You can. There's no rule that says a memoir or an autobiography has to be completely true. So, for example, I know people who have combined characters. So maybe there's an aunt and there's a cousin and there's a sister who all have the same negative reaction. You could create one character who represents one person in your memoir that represents that point of view. See what I mean? So you still tell your truth in in quotation marks, non-fiction way, but you are using the techniques of fiction to hide or obscure the people involved. And also you're using a different name so that you are protecting them in that kind of secondary way. And this is where that being removed from the situation is very important, because some people write memoir as a weapon in order to hurt other people. And sometimes they're aware of that and sometimes they're not aware of that. So this is the thing. If you're 2 years out, and I don't know you, so I hope you don't mind this, but if, your father, if you'd have written that a year later, you might have been so angry at your father that the work came across as angry. And, you had to be a long time distant from that to feel like you'd got over that anger. And many people writing memoir have these emotional reactions that they almost need to get out. And, they almost want people to find out. So there's so much emotional resonance with these difficult topics. So then coming back to fiction, what you have to do with a novel, the primary reason to write a novel is to entertain a reader. So if you have I want to write a book about, how suicide hurts the children, or, you can't have that in a novel in a very, strong way, like a line that says, the meaning of this book is this. You actually have to tell a story that entertains the reader. So I think it's so difficult to know. I mean, I've actually told people who have written a memoir that they could rewrite that as a novel and it might reach a wider audience. So often that might be the way to do it, or, really thinking about what is driving you. And this is where you have to be very self-aware, very, know yourself in order to decide where your story, whether it's your story, are you the character, or are you going to invent a character who goes through a similar situation, but you still have to have a much bigger world, a much bigger story if you're writing a novel than if you are a memoir. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And because I got inspired to try to write a novel last year during November, during National Novel Writing Month, and I kind of used that month to inspire me to write every day. And I decided I'll write what I know. I know about hospice, so I'll write a story of a patient in hospice, of course. That's what I know. And after I wrote it, I realized, oh, wait, I wrote this as if I was writing a nonfiction story about someone. It was a fictional character, but I realized I tried to make everything I wrote so true to life that anyone else would read it and think, oh, yes, I know, I've had a patient just like this. This is true to hospice. But then I realized writing a novel actually opens the door. It actually gives you the freedom. I don't have to be limited by those constraints of making everything so true to life. The writing fiction, I just discovered this, would give me so much more freedom to just go off in different directions and go way beyond those boundaries that I feel when I write nonfiction. And so anyway, I think that was a good transitional experience for me to realize there's a big step between nonfiction and fiction, and I have to learn a little more before I can get there and write really good fiction.
Desecration was my fifth novel. So sorry about that. I mean, that's the first book when I feel like I was able to let go of what I should write or what I knew I could write, and when I stopped self-censoring. So it's very interesting because you obviously write about death and some topics that people consider taboo. So it's very interesting to see what you might end up writing. I mean, you might end up writing sort of comedy romance or something. Which would be hilarious. But I think this is the thing with fiction. What I've discovered is you often don't know the deeper meaning of your story. If you lean into it, if you trust the creative process, you may find that you feel differently to what society tells you should feel. Like we know with grief, like I mentioned, anger, you're not meant to feel angry at people who die, but many people do feel angry. That's like one of the things people feel. And, that's or relief. That's relief and guilt, because you feel relief. Somebody died and you're meant to be very sorry that they died, but actually you're grateful. And that can be a terrible thing. But yet that's actually a truth about some people's death. And when you write, like I've just written a first draft, I've got a second draft now, a book called Map of Shadows. And I thought I was writing a certain type of book. And I wrote my author's note at the end, and I realized that I was very angry at, I guess, the death of Europe. Britain voted for Brexit to leave the European Union. I did not vote that way. I voted to remain. And it's a huge deal. I know, this is not a political show, but there's a lot of political, grief in the world right now, in America and Britain. And I realized that this book was a response to someone taking away my passport, my right to move around my continent of Europe, and the kind of losing an identity that I've had my whole life. So this is what I find with fiction, and I really encourage people to write fiction, because I think that you can almost kid your brain into writing something, and then you realize something much deeper later on. Whereas with nonfiction, you're like, I'm going to write a book about grief, and you write a book about grief. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it's interesting that it has been hard for me to let go of the constraints and the boundaries, but I realized from being trained in medicine, so I've done academic writing, clinical writing a lot in the past, and then my nonfiction books that were one step removed from that. But I realized I have to really let myself go, and I have to stop. I love your term self-censoring, because that's exactly what I've been doing, is that, well, as a doctor, I should only write things like this. I should only write in this way, and that I really have to let those boundaries go and just let my creativity kind of explore and go wherever it wants to. Writing about anything, I guess, maybe that would be a helpful exercise to just write about any topic for a while and break free from these limitations I've put on myself.
Yes, because, I imagine as a doctor, with the do no harm type of approach, and you're, choosing to talk about these topics, you're being very edifying and helpful and lovely to a whole load of people. And it's kind of interesting because, I believe very much in the shadow side, this darker side of our personality that for most people would be talking about death or, thinking about death. For you, that's not your darker side, because you're doing that by choice with your normal life. So I'm fascinated to you're going to have to send me your book in probably 3 to 5 years time, by the time you've actually worked out what the hell you're writing. I think it's so interesting. So I was going to ask you, have you read Dr. Sleep by Stephen King?
No, I haven't.
We should look at that, because it's the follow-up to The Shining. So I'm a real fan of Stephen King, and I know you've talked about some supernatural experiences with end of life, and that Dr. Sleep is set at the beginning in a hospice, which is interesting. And then the other one is the travels book. So Michael Crichton's book Travels, because of course Michael Crichton was a medical doctor.
Yes.
Who then wrote thrillers where, people died and everything. But his Travels is his nonfiction book about his own experiences around the world. And I know you've been traveling recently, so I would recommend both of those two books as interesting for you and your audience.
That's wonderful. I'll definitely look into both of those. I was aware of, I knew Michael Crichton was a doctor, and I've read some of his books or seen movies actually in the past too, but that sounds perfect, especially to read about travels. Yes, especially I have a trip coming up. Coming up as we record this podcast. By the time it broadcasts, I'll probably be back home from the trip. But yes, a trip coming up in Italy where I want to be writing about grief, partly because in 2 previous trips to Italy, I have had experiences of loss just at the beginning of the trip or during the middle of the trip, finding out that someone died while I was in Italy. And so it turned out to that traveling through Italy was really healing for me, to work through some of the grief and just being connected with the people in the country and the food and the land. I found all of it to be really healing and supportive. So I'm going back again to write a little more about that.
Yeah, that's good. And I also think Italy as a country has a relationship with death that, from my travels in America, I don't feel that America has. Maybe that's to do with the age of the civilization. You can, in Rome, you can see, where lots of people died in the Colosseum, where they ripped people apart with lions, which I don't believe they have in America.
No.
Thankfully. But you also have, and I've written a lot about Italy, but I was in Italy just a couple of weeks ago, and in a Catholic church right in the north of Italy, I was in the Dolomites, which used to belong to Austria. So, of course, Italy's had a lot of war, and in this particular church, this was a tiny village in the mountains, nothing special. And I went into the Catholic church. I often go to graveyards and churches. I know you understand this. And I went into the church, and there was what they call the sort of bejeweled skeleton, so the saint. By the altar, a full-on skeleton dressed in lace and jewels and a crown, which they don't worship, but they have, the bones of martyrs in the churches, in the cathedrals. And then, of course, they've even got that in St. Paul's, the bones of popes. I find Italy fascinating for its sort of crypts and catacombs and its acceptance of death as part of life. So do you find that, and also I guess I write about Jerusalem, which for me is very bound up with death, and Varanasi in India, which, the burning ghats where they have, where they burn the bodies every day. These places in the world which are very tied into the human experience of death. Do you think that's part of why you're drawn to Italy, this kind of older culture?
Yes, absolutely. Because I remember on one of our trips there, we got the news that my brother-in-law had died suddenly while we were there. We were unable to go back home early, so we completed our trip. But in the midst of just carrying this grief with us, but to sit in the Colosseum, as you mentioned, or the Roman Forum, or anywhere there are ruins, and you suddenly think of the vastness, the depth of this history. There's layer after layer after layer of history, so many tragedies, so many losses, so much destruction that has happened in that country and that culture. And then you also see vibrant life, people who love life, and they love being, they love eating. They love spending hours with their food, and they eat amazing food, and they seem to savor life and enjoy life. And to me, they're all tied together, that it's when you have this depth and you can appreciate that, yes, everything will eventually die. That depth is what helps you have such love for being alive and appreciation for the fact that I'm here today in this moment. I'm gonna love all of it, everything around me. And so that's what came to me in Italy, and I just feel uh, filled up with that sense when I'm traveling there.
Yeah, and I travel a lot, and I mean one of the trips I want to do is Mexico Day of the Dead. So I wanted to go to it for a long time, but I don't just want to go to Mexico. I want to be there for Day of the Dead and kind of experience a culture that worships death in many ways, or an acceptance of death. In fact, I have on my desk here, I have one of the the skulls from Day of the Dead, with butterflies on. So it's a kind of combination of a skull with new life. And, that inspires me all the time for my writing. Partly, it's not that I believe that after I'm dead, people will go on and read my books. I mean, all writers would like that, but that only happens to a very few. But it's more that I feel that while I am alive, I want to write the things that I care about the most, and investigating and thinking about death is something that I'm kind of obsessed with, death culture and thinking about this type of thing, but also, just kind of digging down into the things that I want to learn about and understand, and the cultures that I'm fascinated with, and then write stories that help people become, sort of sideways, tell them about these things. So coming back to desecration, to try and get people to think about what does it mean what does it matter if your physical body ends up in a jar after you're dead? I don't know, but I imagine you think the same as me, that the physical body is not you anymore.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So why does it matter? And yet when we go into, like, many people don't even want to think about that. They don't want to think about, that kind of thing. And in fact, looking at burial and cremation and some of the things we're doing with dead bodies, there's a lot of things we should be fixing about these industries. And I find this stuff so interesting because people avoid talking about it or thinking about it or reading about it. And as a writer, you can connect with someone else's brain at a different point in time. So there'll be people who find my book or your book and have a mind meld with us at a different point in their life, when hopefully they need that, and we can share our experience. So that's what drives me as a writer, is how much can I experience while I'm alive, and how much can I share of that with other people.
And I love what you mentioned, that fiction is kind of a sideways approach to getting people to just think about these topics. And it's a less threatening way than directly saying to them, me writing it directly to them, you're going to die someday and you need to plan ahead and think about that. But to present them with a fictional story that they can engage with and characters they can be fascinated by, it's a way to, I think, a more gentle way to introduce them, to get them to start thinking about their own impermanence and the fact that they won't be here forever, by experiencing that vicariously through the book.
Yeah, and in fact, right now we're living at a very exciting time in history as a writer because of the growth in TV. So, there's a lot of very good TV out there right now. Like a few years ago, we gave up our TV, and then as Netflix and Amazon Prime and, these other streaming services have picked up really, really good stories. So The Handmaid's Tale, we're recording just after the Emmys, so The Handmaid's Tale kind of swept the board, and, that as a TV show, obviously that was a book first by Margaret Atwood, but I got taught that book at A-level, which in Britain is between 16 and 18 years old, and I hated it. I thought it was terrible. I was like, yeah, whatever, literature. And then watching the TV adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale, you think about a lot of deeper things around politics and gender and all these different things, and about death, because, there's a lot of death there. Game of Thrones, another huge series as we're talking in 2017. And Game of Thrones, the tagline is, kind of all men must die, and has probably the biggest body count on TV. I mean, it really does. And what's interesting is, sometimes those deaths are surprising, and the characters are dealing with grief and revenge and, surviving. And I think, like you say, you can write, this is the power of fiction. You can write something that has that deeper topic without preaching. So there's only so many times in your book, so what really matters, about death. And it's kind of like, okay, so these things matter, and you've told it. And really it could, probably could be a really short book. This matters, living matters, yay. But you could turn your 7 lessons for living into 7 whole novels about the deeper meaning of death underlying, the themes of your nonfiction book. So that's what I think is fascinating about fiction, is kind of turning it. It's more like a parable. You're not preaching it. You're actually telling a story where the realization bubbles up in the reader, where they go, oh, I wonder about that,
Yes, and it can even be working subconsciously on a reader. The story works its way into their consciousness, and over time they might find themselves suddenly having deeper and deeper realizations about the meaning of that story when they're able to see it and able to accept it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why I also, encourage people to write different types of characters. So I have a very international family, and my niece is mixed race. Her father is Caribbean, Black, British, and her mum is my sister, who's white. So, because I have a mixed race young girl in my family, I want to write books where she could say, oh, I see myself, I can see that there are people who are mixed race who are fighting and surviving and strong, and or I have people who are disabled or gay or females, and just when you think about the stories of our lives and people listening, like who you are, or older people, why can't you have a superhero who's in their 70s? I mean, seriously, we haven't seen that yet.
That's very true.
Yeah, there's some really interesting ways that we can use stories to help people. So just coming back to grief and death, a story written by a 25-year-old whose partner died is going to, from cancer, say, is going to be very different to a story written by a 70-year-old whose partner died of cancer. So the death might be the same type of cancer, but the story of the surviving partner might be very, very different, and written in a, looking back or looking forward or whatever, in a very different way. Oh, actually, just thinking about one of my favorite films is The Notebook. Have you seen that?
Yes.
So we don't want to ruin it for people, but the Notebook, very powerful. Nicholas Sparks wrote the book, and then they made it into a film. I think we can say it's about Alzheimer's and dementia without giving too much away. But that, to me, that's actually managed to tell the story of both a young person and an old person in a way that touched a multi-generational experience of grief and the fear of dementia. Like, the charity I give to is called Dignity in Dying, which is about campaigning for people to have the choice to die if they are terminally ill. They shouldn't have to go to Switzerland. If it happens to me, I want a glass of champagne and the pink pill. I don't have children. I'm child free. I want, I want that choice as I've chosen to live my life. I want to choose my death. And my greatest fear is dementia and Alzheimer's and losing my mind. And, it's horrible. But that's a novel. So The Notebook, to me, is a much more memorable story about something I'm afraid of than reading a non-fiction book on the problems of dementia and Alzheimer's, for example.
And the truth is, if it's a subject that we're somewhat afraid of, we're not likely to pick up a nonfiction book. Most of us are not likely to want to confront ourselves with the things that make us uncomfortable. But if it's written into a novel and the novel is enticing in so many other ways, it just happens to be part of the story, I think it's much easier for someone to read about it and then begin to gain some comfort with it, with understanding that. So I think this is making a perfect case for more fiction writing about these subjects.
Oh, absolutely. So everyone go and write a novel now.
Well, I mentioned already that your podcasts and the things that you teach have really helped me have the courage to actually try writing fiction, and I have a long way to go and a lot to learn there. But one of the things that I found really helpful that you talk about a lot is overcoming self-doubt. And I was thinking, everyone out there, of these 80% of people who want to write a book but don't do it, that self-doubt might be one of the reasons why in the end they give up on the process. And so I was hoping you'd share with us some of your tips about that, about dealing with doubt.
Yeah, sure. And unfortunately, I've got to tell everyone that you're never going to get rid of it. So basically, self-doubt is part of the creative process. And, you know, I've been in conferences with writers who are top of the New York Times list, who have been writing for 40, 50 years, who are household names, who've had their books adapted to movies, and they are still crippled with self-doubt with every book. They think that what they've written at the end of the day is a pile of crap, and that it will just never turn into anything good. And yet the difference between someone who manages to get to publication is that you embrace that self-doubt as part of the creative process and you do it anyway. It's a bit like that feel the fear and do it anyway type of book. Is you go, okay, so I'm feeling like this is terrible, but that's okay because I'm just going to do the work. And there's a book by Stephen Pressfield called War of Art, and he has another one called Do the Work, which I reread every year because it helps me realize that this is what everybody feels. So, you know, I've heard multi-million bestsellers saying that they feel like an imposter, that someone's going to find out that they can't actually write, even though they've written like 100 books or whatever. So I think that the main thing is to go through the steps. Like I'm an independently published author. So as if you were traditionally published, I use professional editors. So of course you can mitigate some of that self-doubt by using professional editors, but you will still have that feeling. And in fact, when I published my first novel, I recorded a video on YouTube. Basically, I cancelled my launch drinks. I was kind of devastated when that novel came out. I was like, oh my goodness, people are going to read my thoughts, my deeper thoughts, and that's really scary. But that feeling almost doesn't ever go away. And if it does go away, then you're not challenging yourself enough. So that would be the other thing, is if you're not going deep and you're not putting yourself into the work and you're not giving everything, then, you know, why are you bothering? You know, you have to bring yourself, and that will bring the self-doubt. But that is what will connect with people, you know, coming full circle on our conversation. You know, the book you write will change your life first and may help other people, but you've got to write for the sake of writing, and the rewards are in writing for yourself. And hey, maybe you'll write the next Harry Potter or maybe you won't. And I'm on book 25 and I haven't, you know, made multi-millions. So, but each book I write helps me learn. And yeah, so self-doubt is just part of the creative process.
And I love that message. If you're trying to write a book that somehow would please everyone, which isn't even possible, then you're writing something that doesn't have very much depth or meaning to it. And why bother? I think that's a really good point. So if you're not challenging your own feelings of self-doubt and you're not diving in that deep, then you may not be really writing something of substance.
Yes, and you know, coming back to what you talk about and your book, you know, what really matters. I think this is important too. You want to go to your grave, you know, with a body of work that you're proud of. And if the book that you're thinking of writing or the idea you have does not tap into what you really care about. And in fact, all of my books, pretty much all of my fiction written under my name, has themes of death, dealing with death, and that darker side. And I will probably be writing along these lines, these themes, all my life, because that's where my interest lies. Until I face death, I'm obviously going to be writing about it, because we only face that once personally, when we finally get to that point. And, it's so, that's the thing. So what really matters to you? Who are you? And it was only when I wrote Desecration that I started sharing, pictures of graveyards that I was traveling to, or talking about, the fact that I'm a taphophile, a graveyard tourist. And what's so interesting now is people connect with that. And some people, probably more of your audience will connect with it than my audience at the Creative Penn. But it's, I get emails almost every week from people sending me pictures from graves they're visiting, of interesting gravestones, or interesting sculpture, or stories about the place they're visiting. And that really shows me that by sharing what matters to me, I attract people who it matters to them as well. And that is a lot of self-doubt tied up in who you really are. Like we were talking before the show about putting your face, on video, in the same way as putting your voice on audio, and putting your words in the world. But when you start sharing what matters to you, you actually attract people who feel the same way. And that's how we build an audience. That's how we can change people's lives. And that's truly exciting.
That's so true. As you're talking about being a taphophile, I'm thinking, as I'm planning my upcoming trip to Italy, I'm thinking about which cemeteries should I visit while I'm there, because I want to make sure I go to, the best cemeteries there. So we do share that. I did want to mention that your book, The Successful Author Mindset, deals with this topic of self-doubt that we were just discussing, and I wanted to mention that to anyone listening. It's a great book to get if you want to start writing and it's your own self-doubts or your own mind that's keeping you from doing the work. It's a great way to start, to read the book, to get inspired, and to remember that we all feel the same way about writing. We all start from the same place. We're all in the same boat as we find the courage to put our words on paper.
And thank you for that. And I wrote that book because I posted a blog post about the roller coaster of being a creative. I hate writing, it's so hard, and then I love writing, it's the best thing in my life, and all of these kind of dichotomies that we have as creatives. And it resonated so much, so I thought, I better talk about that more. And things like my family and friends are not supporting me, and fear of failure, and fear of judgment, which is one of my big things. People might think I'm weird if I write this. There's so many things that we think are just our problem, but actually, humans go through the same experiences. So, we're all on the same path, really.
It's so true. And there's nothing more, I think for me, more stabilizing than when I find out, sometimes in my own head, I think, clearly no one else thinks this way or sees these things or feels what I'm feeling, but that's not the truth. When I discover I'm not alone at all, there are many, many people out there who are right where I am, and we're all struggling in the same way. That really helps me to stay inspired and to keep going and try the next thing and take the next step.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Joanna, I want to tell our listeners where they can get in touch with you and learn more about your work, because I just wanted to say again that anyone who's thinking of writing, whether you're thinking of writing a memoir, a nonfiction book, a fiction book, it's really helpful to have a mentor, and you are an amazing mentor, Joanna, because you're not only an incredible writer, but you've done so much thinking and work about the process of being a writer and how to go through the nuts and bolts of self-publishing. And so, first of all, I want to recommend your podcast, The Creative Penn, on iTunes, Stitcher, probably other places too.
All the usual places. And or people can go to thecreativepenn.com/podcast, and there's all the back episodes there as well. And if people are interested in writing a book, I've got a blueprint on becoming a successful author, which is free, and you can sign up for that at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. So those are probably the best places for writing. And for my fiction, if anyone's interested, I write under JF Penn, S for Francis, and books are in all the usual places in ebook, print, and audiobook as well.
Yeah, so you can, actually, I'm reading Desecration, which is my first fiction novel. I never thought of myself as someone who would like thrillers. So, but I just started with Desecration, knowing that it dealt a lot with death and dying, and now I'm hooked. So now I'm going to be reading. Now, I didn't know I would enjoy a thriller so much. So now I'll be reading your library, I believe, especially as I travel.
Thank you so much. And it's funny because those books, the 3 books mean a lot to me because they do deal with the deeper topics, but the market for them is quite small because of exactly the same reason. So yes, I'm really glad you're reading it because I think you'll understand me without thinking I'm a complete weirdo.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had all the same fears. Here I talk and write about death all the time. People do think I'm strange. But we understand each other in that regard.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on this show, Karen.
You're so welcome, Joanna, and I really appreciate all your work, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you. So take care.
Bye.
Goodbye.